Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ethan Katz. I teach in the history department. I'm also the faculty director of the Center for Jewish Studies here. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture, conversation. And this continues to be really a banner year for programming at the CJS with numerous events with terrific speakers and performances on varied topics. And tonight is no exception. But what is exceptional is that we get to hear from not one eminent scholar, but two, as we have the dynamic duo of David Myers and Nomi Stolzenberg to discuss their still new-ish book entitled American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic Village in Upstate New York, published in 2022 by Princeton University Press. These are two extraordinarily distinguished speakers with very impressive records and scholarship that is terrifically wide-ranging in its subject matter and its impact. For the sake of brevity, relative brevity, I'm going to confine my remarks about each of them. David Myers is currently distinguished professor at UCLA, where he holds the Sady and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History. Since the fall of 2017, he has served as the director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. He also recently began to direct a major and innovative new project called the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. A number of people had the privilege of hearing David at lunch today speak about this initiative and his larger insights about situations on our campuses. I was sorry I couldn't be there, I was teaching. David was previously chair of the UCLA History Department. Before that, he was chair and in many ways the architect and builder of the Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. Since 2003, he has been co-editor of one of the top journals in our field, Jewish Quarterly Review. Now, given the depth and breadth of this institutional work, it is astonishing that David's publication record is also extremely impressive. He has authored or co-authored 6 books and edited or co-edited a dozen others, primarily in the fields of modern Jewish intellectual and cultural history, but across a vast array of topics ranging from Jewish history and memory to Zionism to Jewish thought to secularism and religion in modern Jewish life. I'm only going to pause for a moment over 2 of David's publications, which for me remain fundamental and which I believe indicate a great deal about the kind of historian and public intellectual that he is. The first is his first monograph, which came out of his dissertation, entitled Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, published by Oxford University Press in 1995. In this book, David took up the work of those Jerusalem intellectuals who formed the first generation of Jewish studies scholars at the Hebrew University. He showed at once how innovative their scholarship was and that it was indebted to earlier generations of Jewish studies scholars. He saw their connection to the Zionist ideological project and their efforts to maintain a sense of scholarly objectivity. And he drew fascinating parallels between these scholars and Western-educated natives in colonial societies who used the tools of their Western education to shape a new national historiography, at once indigenous and Westernized, for their own nationalist purposes. This widely acclaimed book, drawing upon a range of archival fragments and beautifully composed, became an instant classic and remains almost 30 years on the defining work on the so-called Jerusalem School of Jewish Studies scholars. The second work I want to focus on is Between Jew and Arab, the Lost Voice of Shimon Ravidovich, published in 2011, I believe, which rests... Sorry? 2008. I'm sorry, David. Thank you. I was way off. It rescues from relative obscurity a vital and fascinating voice, Shimon Ravidovich, who was, as David shows, at once a utopian in his vision of coexistence between Jews and Arabs, and a realist in his understanding from early on of the necessity to solve the so-called Arab question if one wanted to solve the so-called Jewish question. And Ravidovich argued in a powerful essay, which he published in the late 1950s, which is translated and published for the first time in David's book, that these two questions could not be separated, that Israel could only be strong if it permitted Palestinians to return. Ravidovich wrestles with bracing honesty with many of the most difficult issues that still plague the conflict to this day, elevating the issue of Palestinian right of return at a time when almost no Zionist would have dared to broach it. And indeed, in his own work, his scholarship, and his frequent public commentary, David is also at once daring and measured, always drawing our attention to the most central questions that are often easier left alone, but absolutely necessary to face. He does so with a combination of courage, empathy, thoughtfulness, and self-reflection that I think is exceedingly rare and that today is more valuable than ever. Believe it or not, his wife is no less impressive. I'll get to that. Nomi Stolzenberg has been a member of the faculty at the USC Gould School of Law since 1988. Her research, like David's, spans a vast range of interdisciplinary interests. These include law and religion, law and liberalism, law and psychoanalysis, and law and literature. Nomi is a committed advocate of multidisciplinary research and teaching, and in fact, she helped establish the USC Center for Law, History, and Culture, which involves scholars and students from throughout USC coming together, and which she is currently, the co-director. Now, Nomi's a law scholar, okay, so she rarely publishes books. Instead, she publishes vast articles of extraordinary erudition, meticulously footnoted, which in my field would indeed simply be published as books, usually, with a fancy introduction and conclusion passively added on. I mean, seriously, for those who don't know, we're talking about articles that are 80, 90, sometimes 100 pages long. But how many of these law articles has Nomi published, you might ask? About 36, 37 to be precise, at least by my count. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about each of them. No. In her case as well, I'll focus on two publications briefly. First, her widely cited article, He Drew a Circle That Shut Me Out, Assimilation, Indoctrination, and the Paradox of a Liberal Education, published in the Harvard Law Review in 1993. This article takes up, with what I could gather was kind of unprecedented seriousness, the paradox of assimilation and cultural diversity, discussing in particular the effort of religious institutions to claim that assimilationist norms violate the neutrality that they purport to defend. She resists easy answers to this problem, instead exploring questions of harm, indoctrination, and liberalism and how they all implicate but do not resolve the central dilemma. Thus, she offers very forthrightly a series of partial solutions that remain the best available tools, concluding powerfully that for the foreseeable future, quote, the paradox of neutral exposure as indoctrination will haunt us, and it is best to look this paradox in the face. And I have to say the staying power of her insights more than 30 years on is also quite remarkable. The second publication I want to mention specifically is Writing the Relationship Between Race and Religion in Law, published in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies in 2011. Now, this article is ostensibly a book review, but it is much more than that. Instead, it's a profound meditation on the failure of scholars to effectively think through the importance of religion in the study of race and vice versa. And Nomi teases out various ways that race and religion can be linked and play mutually constitutive roles in the development of modern law. Nomi doesn't just teach law in an academic sense. She's been immersed in the world of law and legal debates for her entire career. She was a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law, where she was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. She clerked for Judge John Gibbons of the U.S. Court of Appeals, Third Circuit, before she joined the USC Gould Law School. She's a member of the Kahn Center's advisory board, the Radcliffe Accelerator Group on Religion and Racism, the Progressive Property Roundtable, and the editorial board of the Journal of Law, Culture, and the Humanities. And she teaches all kinds of courses on First Amendment issues, family law, feminist legal theory, and I could go on. I'm just going to conclude with a few personal reflections. I got to know David and Nomi for the first time when we were all fellows at the Katz Center in Philadelphia, 2009 to 2010. Now, unfortunately for me, I know David much better, not because David's not great, but because Nomi's great too. And I really learned so much from, I had just finished graduate school, I just finished my PhD, and being around David, he's extraordinarily generous intellectually and particularly takes younger scholars under his wing. And also to watch David in a seminar week after week is, as I've told some people, to learn how to ask really good questions. Meanwhile, throughout this year, I kept hearing, well, Nomi should be here, and she's going to come in the spring. She's only going to be here for a short time, and I didn't know her, barely knew who she was. Yet when she came, there were a variety of guests who came throughout the year. The year was focused on secularism, and usually when the guests came, they really gave seminars that were not super helpful because they weren't immersed in the year, and they didn't really do the work they needed to do to understand the context for what we were doing. Nomi shows up. She does this seminar that blows everybody away. She knew all of the intricacies of all the legal debates on secularism. She gives a whole fresh perspective that we haven't heard all year. And I have to tell a little story, which is that a friend of ours who is also married to a very impressive academic comes over to David afterwards and says, "I just wanted to come over in solidarity. My wife shows me up all the time." So we are here to hear about a book that they were just getting going on when we were fellows together at the Katz Center. So it's a personal thrill for me that the book is out and that they're here to talk about it. It is entitled American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic Village in Upstate New York. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Ethan. Can you hear me in the back? Great. Thank you, Ethan, for that exceptionally generous introduction, and thank you for all of the extremely important work you're doing in these times. It's much appreciated by people near and far. This seems like a family reunion. We know a good number of people in the audience, some of whom are family, many of whom are dear friends. I do want to just take the opportunity to thank Etta and Jennifer for all of the work that they put in to make this event possible. I also want to acknowledge someone who for me was really a model in the kind of mentoring and engagement that you spoke of, Ethan, and that's my dear friend and colleague and source of inspiration, David Beal. So great to have you with us, David. So this is kind of the tail end of our book circuit. We've given scores of talks in many different settings, and this, I think, is the last one that we have on our schedule. And we decided to shake it up a little bit. We typically would run through a slide deck and give people a very visual sense of the community that we studied for a very long time. We'll talk about that. But we decided for this last presentation, we would just talk to each other and maybe ask the questions that we would like to be asked of us. Many of them were asked of us by some excellent moderators. But we're going to try this mode of conversing with one another.
So if we refer to our phones, we're not checking messages. It's only because we put notes of the questions on our phones.
And we've established some ground rules. We absolutely can interrupt each other without causing any great offense. So don't be alarmed if that occurs. So I'm going to just toss it over to Nomi to begin to talk about the genesis of this book, which Ethan very generously said that in 2009 we were just at the beginning, by which I think he meant we were a good 5 years into the project that took about 15 years. So how did this come about?
Well, the genesis, as you will recall, was actually 30 years ago in 1994. When the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, handed down a decision in a case called Lewis Grummet versus the school district of the village of Kiryas Joel. It got a lot of news coverage. It was the first time I think either of us and most of the United States had ever heard of the village of Kiryas Joel, which was a lot smaller then. What was its population in 1994?
8,000.
8,000. And today it's?
38,000.
38,000. A village that we all learned at that time that was founded by and populated entirely by members of the Satmar Hasidim, a legally recognized incorporated municipality about an hour's drive from New York City. And the decision handed down by the Supreme Court in 1994 was addressing the constitutionality of a statute that had been enacted by the New York State legislature and signed into law by then Governor Mario Cuomo in 1990, or at the very end of 1989, permitting this totally homogeneous, insular community, this village, to have its own public school district. Now, why a Hasidic community that mainly sends its children to private schools, because in the United States of America, religious schools have to be private, would want a public school district is something we might get into later.
We will definitely get into
But the question that the Supreme Court was addressing was whether this law authorizing the establishment of a separate public school district within this village was constitutional. And more specifically, whether it violated the Establishment Clause, the First Amendment's prohibition on the establishment of a state religion, for this law to allow the creation of a public school district. That seized my attention, in part because I had just finished writing the article that Ethan mentioned, that was focused on another conflict between a very different insular traditionalist religious group and the state. This is an article I published a little over 30 years ago that was really examining lawsuits that were then being brought in the 1980s by fundamentalist Christians, that's how they still describe themselves then, who were suing their school boards, claiming it was a violation of their right to the free exercise of religion for their children to be exposed to what they called secular humanism. Those battles against so-called indoctrination into secular humanism by public schools that were raging in the 1980s are really a foreshadowing of the battles over school boards that are raging over the supposed indoctrination in critical race theory and LGBTQ rights going on today. And as Ethan sort of mentioned, I was fascinated in those cases by this paradox of liberal tolerance, that it seemed to be required to be intolerant in some respects with respect to a community that was anti-liberal, illiberal, opposed to a form of education that would inculcate belief in liberal values in its children. And it seemed to me that the question that was being presented to the Supreme Court in the case concerning the village of Kiryas Joel represented the flip side of that paradox, right? Whereas the secular humanism cases that I'd first written about showed the way in which liberal tolerance runs out and the way in which a liberal state and a liberal society can be paradoxically intolerant and in some ways repressive vis-a-vis illiberal communities. Here was a situation in which it seemed to me that what was being demonstrated was the ways in which liberalism, the basic fundamental rules of our liberal constitutional order, turned out to be curiously facilitative of a deeply illiberal separatist community. So it seized my attention in 1994. I joined a small band of other First Amendment law and religion scholars who wrote about the case then. It was very limited analysis in which I basically advanced a hypothesis. It was nothing more than a hypothesis then. But basically that it seemed to me that the issue that the court was focusing on, which was the constitutional issue as to whether or not the state actors and the state action involved in this case, that is to say, the action of the New York State legislature in passing a law that allowed this village to have its own separate school district, the action of the Kiryas Joel school board, school district, that's a state actor, the village of Kiryas Joel itself, which is a municipality. The analysis was entirely focused on the question of whether it was permissible under the First Amendment for state action to serve the goals of a religious community. And it seemed to me that while that's not an unimportant question, it is of really secondary importance. Because however the court decided the case, whether or not it decided to dissolve the school district, or even if it went further and dissolved the municipality, the community was going to remain in place. And it was going to continue to function. It was with all of the accoutrements of a village and all of the exclusionary characteristics and internally coercive characteristics, or you might just say internally intense commitment to live in strict adherence with Jewish law, whether or not the courts decided it was permissible for it to be officially recognized as a municipality or as a school district. But that was just a sort of hypothesis. I wrote my little piece in maybe it came out in 1995, and I thought I was done with it until 10 years later. So maybe I'll turn it to you to pick up the story there.
So sometime in the early 2000s, we, at the dinner table, would be talking about our work. And Nomi's interest, as I understood it at the time, was really in the efforts of strong forms of subcommunity, particularly religious subcommunity, to find their place on the legal and political landscape of the United States. And so she was interested in fundamentalists in Tennessee and followers of a yogi in Oregon, and a small little community of Hasidic Jews in what we then thought of the time as upstate New York. And I have to say that one of the most persistent criticisms of our book is the use of the term upstate to refer to...
The greatest controversy, yeah.
To refer to a physical location an hour north of New York City. So I just have to say that from the perspective of a native of, or resident of Syracuse, Kiryas Joel is not upstate. But for anyone who dwells in the 5 boroughs, anything north of the Bronx is unmistakably upstate. So at certain points, we'll refer to Kiryas Joel as located in suburban New York, and at some points, upstate New York. So we'd be talking at the dinner table, and I just became fascinated as a Jewish historian in the case of this group of Hasidic Jews who succeeded not only in creating what they called, at an earlier point in time, a Shtetl, which we'll talk about, but a self-regulating form of local sovereignty, as we called it, a village that was part of a larger town, the town of Monroe. We have someone here who has a connection to the town of Monroe. I was fascinated by this because one of the most consistent questions that I've asked in my scholarship on the modern Jewish experience is how did Jews manage or attempt to carve out a large form of, a very strong form of group solidarity in physically concentrated locations.
And political self-determination.
And achieve a degree of, or some measure of political autonomy, even sovereignty. So I've been really fascinated by not so much the successes, but the struggles and the failures of Jews to carve out that space of autonomy or sovereignty in the face of very substantial countervailing forces ranging from fascist totalitarianism on one hand to liberal assimilationism on the other. How have Jews sought to assert a strong form of community? For Nomi, that was part of a series of religious subcommunities that were attempting similar things. And for me, this was a really exceptional story that I had to find out more about. And so what I did was I wrote a letter to the community and asked, could I come and conduct research? And
well, let's back up for a minute. First, you proposed that we write this book.
Oh, yes, that is true. Yes. First, I proposed that we write this book, which I have to say wasn't greeted, the question wasn't greeted with a great deal of enthusiasm at first.
I was hesitant, but little did I know how long and how challenging it would be.
Yeah, it was a journey. It was a journey. It's about the journey more than the destination, I think.
Well, both. Yeah.
Anyway, so I raised the subject with Nomi, and she said, "All right, I guess. I mean, see what you can find out." So I wrote a letter to sort of the chief public-facing official in the community. At that time, it was the superintendent of the public schools, of the public school. To my great surprise, the person said, yeah, come on over. We'll have a conversation. And that was the first, but not last, by any stretch of the imagination, instance of being surprised by what I encountered in the community. It really was a series of unfolding surprises. And it continued when I actually made my way to Orange County, New York, to the town of Monroe and the village of Kiryas Joel, and began to talk to the people whom I initially had access to, who were the leaders of the community. And by that I mean the leaders of the religious congregation and the leaders of the village administration, some of whom were the same people, right? Which raises all sorts of interesting questions about the relationship between religion and state in the United States. What I heard from people when I first made my way there was, your timing is good. We've been around for 25 years as an officially recognized municipality, and I'll give a little bit of the history a little bit later. We're interested in someone holding up a mirror so that we can sort of see how we look. Or another person said, really serving as a kind of window to let us know how people from the outside regard us. And that was, first of all, surprising to hear that there was a willingness to engage in conversation with me about the community, and even to allow me to conduct research. But it was also an indication of how American the phenomenon was, because the people with whom I spoke said, we believe in transparency and we should be accountable to sort of the larger world. I mean, this language of transparency and accountability, is drawn straight from American public policy speak of that era. So it was really eye-opening to me. And so I began, as the kind of field researcher. Little did I know that over the course of time, I would really have to retool myself as a researcher. I, like David, am an intellectual historian. We largely study mostly published, but sometimes unpublished texts by people who oftentimes are no longer with us. This was a very different undertaking. This was about dealing with live human subjects, very live, very animated, who had a wide range of opinions, which was, I suppose, the second major surprise, because I went to this community, all of whose residents were members of the Satmar Hasidic group, and discovered that there was remarkable diversity amongst them, in not so much in dress norms, but in overall outlook about the place of the community in the United States, how it should be run, by whom it should be run. And that turned out to be a very substantial advantage, because soon enough I discovered what I kind of already knew, which was that following the death of the founding rabbi or rebbe of the Satmar Hasidic group, a man by the name of Joel Teitelbaum, after whom the village of Joel is named, the first of many deeply fractious divisions emerged within the community. And I can describe them a bit later, but what I want to say is that the existence of those factions within the community and that fractiousness was an incredible boon to my research. Because when I encountered people, they would say, "Who are you? What do you want? And then, with whom did you speak?" And if I told them that I spoke with someone from Team A, and they were from Team B, they would say, come to my house, and I'll give you 15 minutes of time. 3 hours later, I was slumped in a corner asleep, and they had only gotten through half of the story. The existence of those competing factions was an incredible gift, because people were very anxious to speak in order to have their story be heard.
David.
And I'll just finish by saying that was yet another in the string of surprises to discover that what seemed to be this sea of uniformity was actually teeming with division and fractiousness, and in some cases, even physical violence, intergroup violence.
And a lot of legal conflict. But before we get into the story of the divisions, I'm thinking that maybe we should give a quick nutshell description of who, of the character of this community, of the founding Rebbe, and of this village.
Yeah, thank you for that compliment. So I mentioned that the village is named after a rabbi named Joel Teitelbaum, who belonged to one of the most prominent Hasidic families in the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what was really perhaps the most important incubator of what we know of today as Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox Judaism. It stood at sort of the juncture of currents from the West and the East, Enlightenment currents from the West, and new traditionalist currents coming from the East and North. And it created a unique blend of sensibilities, one of whose chief exponents was the Teitelbaum family, which believed in sort of an intensely scrupulous observance of Jewish law that was to be promoted through a kind of war against various layers of contamination in the world. There was a deeply combative spirit in the Teitelbaum family, which young Joel Teitelbaum inherited as he made his way in the early 20th century from one community to another, establishing in each place a coterie of followers, all of whom were drawn to his intense mix of learning, piety, and sort of commitment to battle for the sake of Torah. He makes his way to a town that after 1920 was no longer part of the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but became part, after the Treaty of Trianon that followed the First World War, became part of Romania. The town used to be known in Hungarian as Satmar, and after the war, it became known as Satu Mare, which people there's a kind of folk legend that suggests that it means Saint Mary, which it does not. So people are sort of anxious to find all sorts of ironies and paradoxes when talking about Satmar Hasidim. Anyway, Joel Teitelbaum makes his way to that community, the largest of the communities that he had served as town rabbi for. He's elected in 1928 as town rabbi after 3 elections because there was fierce opposition to him, given his own extraordinary intensity and judgmentalism in upholding Jewish law, as well as one of the defining features of his overall intellectual and religious sensibility, which was unrelenting opposition to Zionism. Joel Teitelbaum is probably the most important Jewish anti-Zionist of the 20th century. He makes his way to Satu Mare, he's elected. There still remains very considerable opposition. He doesn't actually take up his position for 6 years. He arrives in Satu Mare in Romania in 1934. The community only exists for 10 years. It's one of the newest forms of Hasidism and one of the largest. It's perhaps the largest Hasidic group in the world today, one of certainly the 2 or 3 largest, twice the size of Lubavitch or Chabad Hasidism. The community grows over the course of Joel Teitelbaum's tenure in Satu Mare. And then in March 1944, the entente between Nazi Germany and Admiral Horthy, the Hungarian leader, breaks down. Nazi Germany invades, and within...
David, before you go further with that part, I just want to highlight 3 things that David just mentioned. One is the anti-Zionism, surprising to many people. The other is, David talked about how his initial encounter with Kiryas Joel revealed a surprising amount of internal diversity, but the opposition to Reb Teitelbaum's assumption of his position as chief rabbi is reflective of something that was characteristic not only of this Jewish community in Satu Mare, but really of every Shtetl, which was an incredible amount of diversity within the Shtetl, both in the sense that Jews, the Shtetl was not exclusively or even predominantly Jewish. And the Jewish community within the Shtetl that lived along with Gentiles was very, very, very diverse. So I think it's important to just, those will turn out to be important themes as we move forward. But to continue the story.
Okay, so Nazi Germany invades Hungary on March 19th, 1944. Within a matter of months, certainly by the end of the summer, 85% of Satomare's Jewish population had been deported to Nazi concentration or death camps. Joel Teitelbaum manages to escape, and in one of the twists of irony that has constantly hovered above the community, it was owing to the intervention of a Hungarian Zionist official that he was allowed to make his way on a train that made its way first to the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, and then after that to freedom in Switzerland. Joel Teitelbaum lives in Switzerland following the challenging experience in Bergen-Belsen. After that, decides to move to a site where his daughters had, one of his daughters had moved, which is to say Palestine. Again, another irony that he chose to make his way to Palestine, but in the tradition of the Haredi community, the Edah Haredit in Jerusalem, he believes he must go there in order to save it from the Zionists. That experiment lasts about a year, and in September 1946, on Rosh Hashanah of that year, he makes his way to the United States, ostensibly to come for a fundraising trip to support the creation of institutions like a yeshiva, an orphanage, a beis midrash, a study hall in Jerusalem. But for a variety of reasons, his stay in the United States is prolonged. He has supporters from amongst the survivor community, especially in Brooklyn, especially in a part of Brooklyn called Williamsburg, who ask him to remain and begin to build up a community there. And so he leaves Palestine and comes to the United States and then settles in Brooklyn and begins the real work of building up a community of followers. Within a decade, there are 10,000 members of the Satmar community. But as the community begins to develop in Williamsburg, as it creates its own moistus, as their own institutions, schools, ritual baths, study halls, etc., Joel Teitelbaum tells his chief associates, many of whom are fellow survivors, Hungarian, who come to the United States and find their way to this charismatic pietist, tells them we need a place outside of the city to serve as a place of refuge, to serve as a place of refuge from the seductions and allures of a teeming, multicultural urban environment. And that place of refuge would be a place that, according to him, would be far enough away to gain a measure of respite from the allures of the city and close enough to allow for daily commuting. One of the distinctive features of the Satmar community is that, according to Rabbi Teitelbaum, men are to work, are to be employed in gainful occupations. They're to study, to learn in the morning and in the evening, but they are not to spend all of their days in yeshiva or kollel. They are to earn a living. Turns out that that ambition, which was phrased and characterized by Rabbi Joel and his followers as the attempt to find or create a shtetl, was exceptionally difficult, because it turns out that many people in the New York metropolitan area weren't that keen on selling land to a large group of Hasidic Jews. And it took decades until the community leadership figured out an alternative strategy. There was an attempt to buy land in Mount Olive, New Jersey in 1962-63. But when Mount Olive understood the scale of the development project, they hesitated, and that ended up in court, in an ugly court battle, and that attempt failed. There had been earlier attempts to find a place in Staten Island, later attempts in other parts of suburban New York. It was only in 1972 that the leadership of the community, entrusted the task of land purchase to a clean-shaven relative of one of the chief associates of Rabbi Teitelbaum, who served as the front man for the purchase of land in the town of Monroe in Orange County. Over the course of the next 2 years, a development was established in a kind of detached neighborhood of the town of Monroe, 25 single-family homes, 80 garden apartments. And in the summer of 1974, the first Satmar Hasidic Jews began to move out from Brooklyn to this neighborhood of the town of Monroe. Almost immediately, conflicts emerged between the new arrivals and the longtime residents over things like what's a single-family home.
Zoning conflicts, land use.
Land use and zoning. What constitutes a single-family home? If you have two branches of the same family who inhabit a house and together there are 15 or 20 people, is that a single-family home? Sort of cuts against the ideal of the suburban ranch-style home suited for a four-person nuclear family.
It was basically a conflict over one community that brought from the city its not just preference but need for high-density housing, entering into the typical American suburb with its deep-seated demand for low-density housing.
So the first 100 Satmar Hasidim move, or Hasidic first 100 families move out, and almost immediately there are tensions with the neighbors over zoning regulations that intensify over the course of 2 years until October 1976, when the Satmar residents of Monroe file a lawsuit on the basis of religious discrimination in federal district court in Brooklyn against the town of Monroe. That trial was supposed to begin on the 26th of October. I think it was a Tuesday. And after the Sabbath, on the 23rd of October, representatives from the town of Monroe came to the home of one of the chief lieutenants of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum to have an extended discussion that lasted into the wee hours of the morning, in the course of which it was decided to allow this neighborhood to do what is permitted under the laws of the state of New York, to carve itself out as a village within a town. That move would allow this community to oversee its own zoning regulations. All you need, or all you needed at the time, was 500 residents who agreed and a space no larger than 5 square miles. That was agreed upon in the meeting, voted up, and by March 1977, New York State Secretary of State Mario Cuomo signed off on the incorporation of a new village in the state of New York known as Kiryas Joel, or Kiryat Joel, Kiryas Joel, the village of Joel.
So Cuomo, who turns out to be one of a number of significant outsiders who plays a large role in the community, is appearing here in his role as Secretary of State, signing the village into official existence. And 12 years later, as governor, he will sign the public school district of Kiryas Joel into existence. Maybe this is an opportune time to say something about why we chose the title.
Yeah.
American Shtetl. So as David has described, here is a community, survivors, really the vast majority of the community, along with the rest of the Jewish community of Hungary, has been wiped out. And they come, and not only was there the pre-existing desire for a degree of religious purity and isolation from the contaminants of the modern world that predated the Holocaust, but this is, further strengthened by this survivalist mentality, you might say. So, and in the context of transplantation to the United States, that desire to create a more perfectly separated community from the outside world is figured over and over again by the Rebbe and his followers as an act of recreation. We're going to recreate the shtetl that existed in Europe. Hence, Shtetl in the title. Kiryas Joel was very self-consciously designed by its founders to be a shtetl. But, as we've already alluded to, no shtetl in Europe ever had this degree of homogeneity, right? No shtetl was, first of all, exclusively Jewish, let alone exclusively members of one particular sect or brand of Judaism.
It was not segregated in the way that Kiryas Joel was from adjacent towns.
Right, this degree of self-segregation was really unprecedented. All the more so, the degree of political empowerment, right? That this is a community that even though it had not sought from the outset to be, to establish what is, after all, a secular government, a municipality, a subdivision of the state, it attains this incredible degree of political self-determination, political sovereignty, local sovereignty. I mean, you do not see that in Europe. So one reason we say this is an American shtetl is that it was really only in America, that's one of the fundamental arguments of the book, that degree of insularity, homogeneity, and political empowerment on the local level could have been attained. That's one of three ways in which we see this as a very American phenomenon. The second is, while from the standpoint of Jewish history, particularly Jewish history not in America, one thing David was talking about, how he had to retool himself from being really basically an intellectual historian to being more of a social historian. But what you didn't mention is you had not focused on America. You had been a Europeanist and a student of Jewish life in Palestine and Israel. So shifting to America. From the standpoint of Jewish history, there might be something truly unprecedented about this kind of formation. But from the standpoint of American history, it's the very opposite of unprecedented. So whereas for David was sort of saying it was one surprise after another, for me, coming more from the standpoint of an Americanist and having, as David said, been, sort of learning about the experience of many different religious sub-communities, but not only religious sub-communities, other kinds of utopian communities, other types of enclave communities, and also just thinking about patterns of residential segregation in the United States more generally. There's nothing unprecedented about.
Let me just sharpen this point by saying that one of the things we were struck by was really the long genealogy of strong forms of religious subcommunity that had planted themselves on the landscape of the United States, extending back to the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the arrival of the first religious dissidents from Europe and from England in particular, up through perhaps the most successful example of a religious subcommunity asserting itself on the landscape of the United States, which is to say the Mormons in the state of Utah, into the 20th century. So we saw Kiryas Joel as really part of that longer political religious history that is so characteristically, so essentially American.
So that's the second of the sort of three general ways in which we really see the village of Kiryas Joel as somewhat ironically or paradoxically a quintessentially American phenomenon, the way in which it's a continuation of this long history of religious associations and religious experiments. But then the third point that I think has been sort of implicit in a lot of what we've spoken about thus far is that what is truly American and sort of a constant feature of all of these different religious and non-religious enclave communities that are such a characteristic feature of American society is what we call the private pathway to political empowerment. Or another term we use is communitarianism from the bottom up. What do we mean by private pathway? What do we mean from the bottom up? Well, the contrast would be communitarianism from the top down, right? So think about in Europe or in the Ottoman Empire, Jewish enclaves communities that did exist and were not, and also were in some ways endowed with limited but meaningful forms of self-government and political power. That was granted from the top down, right? That was, if the regime, the monarch, the empire wanted to grant a sub-community, be it Jewish or another kind of sub-community, it could and did grant communities charters, right? Give it a particular place of land, give it limited powers of jurisdiction and self-government, entirely top-down. That's not how we do things in the United States of America. And in the period of time in which I was beginning to write, and David, in which we both became scholars, some of you will remember, communitarianism was all the rage. And communitarianism was formulated very much as a critique of liberalism, positing that, and there was a kind of nostalgia for the good old days of the top-down regimes and this sort of trope that that sub-communities, especially traditional religious sub-communities, were better off in the ancien regime, right? Whereas the operative thesis of communitarian critics of liberalism was that living in a liberal society, precisely because of its openness and tolerance and freedoms, would have an atomizing effect on traditional communities and really be the ultimate threat to them. And what we see illustrated by Kiryas Joel, this is what I was talking about, the other side of the paradox of liberalism, precisely the opposite is the case. That the Satmars are just one of many religious communities, going back for hundreds of years, who have been able to successfully establish enclave communities to separate themselves to a very high degree from the outside world and live in accord with their own way of life and their own law. How? The good old American way of buying private property, buying real estate. This is a story of property development, of private property development, and the developers come in and they buy the property in Monroe, they subdivide the property in Monroe. It's a free market story. And so the third and final way in which we sort of say this is really of a piece with American society and of a piece with certain trends in American society, because American society isn't homogeneous either, that this is happening in a way that it's not only religious communities that are able to segregate themselves, but it's the very same mechanisms, market mechanisms, that fuel and facilitate racial and socioeconomic residential segregation. Just the basic tools of, the quintessentially liberal individualistic rights of private property and freedom of contract in the marketplace. Those tools turned out to be an incredibly effective way for the Satmars in particular to be able to create an incredibly strong form of community, of separation, and ultimately to transform that private association into a political public entity. And that's not unique to the Satmars, right? That's the same pathway to strong forms of communitarianism and political empowerment that many religious groups have successfully followed, and that many social groups divided on the basis of other kinds of dividing lines, racial and socioeconomic. Now, not every group is able to succeed, right? Why some are able to use this toolkit, this essentially kind of libertarian toolkit, and others fail to succeed is a subject worthy of study in its own right.
There's another element in the toolkit, another tool in the toolkit that will strike you as exceptionally counterintuitive. And yet it has been a constant, really from the first days of the Teitelbaum family in Hungary in the early 19th century. And that is the presence and persistence of strife. I mentioned that the family was deeply committed to a kind of combative, even martial approach to putative opponents. And what we can say is the community of Kiryas Joel was informed throughout by strife. And I'll give you a few examples of that, but I do want to say that there was a kind of trial run of this kind of experiment that took place in a neighboring county, in Rockland County, New York, when another Hasidic group, the Square Hasidim, made their way in 1954 to the suburbs to find a place of refuge, a safe haven. And then 7 years later, in 1961, established their own village, known as New Square. So we have this earlier example, though it is important to note that I would suggest that Satmar has a more kind of imperial ambition than Square Hasidim, which helps us understand the staggering growth of the community. So in the 1980 census, there were 2,000 residents of Kiryas Joel. I think 1990, 8,000, 2020, 33,000. 2024, the updated census figures are 38,000. Estimates are that by 2040, there may be 75,000 Hasidim in Kiryas Joel. What will become the first all Hasidic city certainly in the United States, certainly outside of Israel, and maybe even, depending how we understand Bnei Brak, in the world. Almost from the beginning, as we mentioned, strife was present, initially over zoning regulations. That contention with neighbors continued throughout every decade of Kiryas Joel's existence, as it became clear that there was just an intense competition for precious natural resources, namely land and water. And as an adjunct of water, sewage, an exceptionally important element in permitting the growth of communities. We're talking about a community in which family size can range from 8 to 15 children.
And how big is Kiryas Joel?
1 square mile.
1 square mile.
This, again, defies the model of the suburbs with the single tract ranch style homes.
High density.
Highest density by a factor of 8 over other communities in Orange County. One builds up in Kiryas Joel, not out. So there was constant strife with proximate neighbors in the town of Monroe and other communities, but there was also strife from within. The founding Rebbe dies in 1979. There's no male heir. The most likely successor, his nephew, the Bayach Moshe, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, is detested by Rabbi Joel's widow, who, it turns out, after Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum is appointed as rabbi of the community, develops a circle of followers around her, who become the first major group of dissidents in Kiryas Joel. So, 2 interesting features. Those are the unity of the community collapses with the death of Rabbi Joel, and we have a woman as the leader of the first group of dissidents. Rabbi Moses Teitelbaum, Moshe Teitelbaum, makes a decision in 1999, after nearly 2 decades, that shocks the community. He tells his eldest son, you get to decide, as putative heir apparent, you get to decide, do you want Kiryas Joel or Williamsburg? Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum is shocked to the core. He assumed he would inherit the mantle of leadership of the entire Malchus Satmar, the kingdom of Satmar. He's given one or the other. He takes Kiryas Joel, where he had been the head of
Chief
the yeshiva,
rabbi.
chief rabbi, and Rabbi Moshe's third son, Zalman Leib, comes back from Jerusalem to take charge of Williamsburg. Well, all hell breaks loose. All hell breaks loose. Not only lawsuits back and forth in defiance of the traditional inhibition by traditionally observant Jews to appeal to Gentile courts, but physical violence breaks out between the two. And you would think that strife, together with the external strife, would blunt the growth of the community. Nothing could be further from the truth. During the worst years of internal strife, the community's population grows. People choose to stay in the community, not to leave to found another satellite. And the same is true of the strife with external neighbors. It never inhibits growth. It certainly belongs to a chief character trait of the Teitelbaum family, and we have to consider it as a possible catalyst in the growth of the community in some distinctly Satmar way. I think we should probably take a few minutes.
How much longer? When do you want us to go until?
We'll take a few more minutes to wrap up.
I mean, maybe take about 5 more minutes and then we can open it
Should
up.
we say something about either what most surprised us or the most interesting characters we ran into along the way?
Sure.
Do you want? Well, so there's so much to talk about, and there are topics that have popped up that we may want to talk about in Q&A, gender, methodology. David talked about doing field work. I didn't do quite so much. That's connected to the gender story. Lots of things to talk about. I would say, whereas oftentimes when I'm asked what most surprised me, I'm sort of stumped, because coming from an American standpoint, most of what I learned sort of seemed like a confirmation of my initial hypothesis. But there were a few things that really did strike me. One was to learn that, of course, as we've emphasized, there's a lot of diversity among Satmars, contrary to appearances. And of course, there are people who grow up in the community and leave, exiters. That's a very interesting phenomenon that we'd be happy to talk more about. And maybe even more interesting are as Ayala Fader, our colleague, has labeled them, the hidden heretics, people who mentally kind of reject the belief system, but choose to stay in the community for a variety of reasons. But many people, including some of the hidden heretics, not only describe their way of life as the most beautiful way of life in the world, but this really struck me. Look with pity upon all the rest of us. That the world outside seems hideous to them. And more specifically, they think, what a lonely existence. It's a world in which people die alone. That struck me a lot. Another thing that was very striking to me was how many of the outsiders who were closely involved with the fate of Kiryas Joel, either as adversaries, litigants, or political opponents, or as their biggest supporters. Not all of them were Jews. Governor Cuomo, Governor Pataki, the two big, but a huge number of the people who interfaced with them were Jews who represented the entire political spectrum, right? From sort of the modern Orthodox leading constitutional litigator, Nat Lewin, who takes the case, and they have a huge stable of lawyers who work for them, sort of on the more right-wing end of the spectrum. In the middle of the spectrum, liberal Jews who are kind of conflicted as between, sort of the good old-fashioned mid-20th century, strict separationists. This has got to be, this is just all wrong. And this is bad for Jews. And this isn't what American Jewry is supposed to look like. But on the other hand, other liberal Jews who are like, but bilingualism, but multiculturalism, but pluralism. But most fascinating to me was that the furthest, not the religious right of the spectrum, but the political right of the spectrum, one of the characters who turned out not directly, but in indirect ways to play a huge role in the legal battles and more generally in reshaping the Supreme Court's approach to the kinds of constitutional issues that were raised in the innumerable legal battles generated by this community, was an American Jew by the name of J. Sekulow. Some of you might have heard that name. When I started doing this research, and I kept seeing his name on every single legal brief, people didn't know his name at that time. I described J. Sekulow as perhaps one of the most influential American Jews in the country, but also one of the most influential American evangelicals. Because J. Sekulow's story is that he was born to an American Jewish family in Brooklyn. Family moved to Long Island. Then they moved, I think, to Georgia, where he went to a local evangelical college, had a born-again experience, became a born-again Christian, became a Jew for Jesus, a Messianic Jew, and ultimately, in the late 80s, early 90s, which is a period of time when the conservative legal movement decided we need to have our own public interest law firms. We need to have our own ACLU. So they formed the ACLJ. I always forget what it stands for, the Alliance for Constitutional Law and Justice. And this then completely unknown character, J. Sekulow, was appointed to direct the ACLJ. And he really has played a singularly influential role in changing the way the United States Supreme Court interprets the First Amendment in ways that prove to be very beneficial and supportive of the separatist agenda of the Sommers.
I think that's a good opportunity for me to jump in. I'll be happy to talk about surprising characters, but what Nomi just said, I think, allows us to sort of put on the table what is one of the most interesting and important takeaways from Kiryas Joel, the story of Kiryas Joel. Its history, if we trace the arc of its history from 1977 to the present, it parallels and intersects with the arc of a resurgent religious Christian conservative movement symbolized by, for example, the birth of the moral majority in 1979. These two movements really operate in parallel except when they intersect at very important points, like the case of Drummond v. Kiryas Joel. And they lead us to really the present when we inhabit a world in which the vaunted wall of separation between religion and state, as Jefferson referred to it, has been brought down, willingly and happily so, in order to create ample space for religion in the American public square, in which the paramount form of constitutional right is religious liberty. That is a world jointly inhabited by Satmar Hasidic Jews and white Christian conservatives who have worked very closely in tandem to achieve that theological and political vision. It is an instance for us of what we call unwitting assimilation, an idea that we talk about at considerable length in the book. And if you haven't yet had a chance to read it, you can find out
Now
more
out
about
in paperback.
now in paper. You can look at it. You can explore that idea in greater detail. But I think we've said enough for now. Thank you for your patience. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you both so much. So we've got some time for questions. If you could raise your hand and then just wait, I will bring you the mic so that we can all hear you.
A family deal.
Thank you for Professor Katz. My name is Leo. I'm one of Professor Katz's PhD students. I will try and be brief. I will try. So you started out by saying, Professor Myers, that you're curious about how Jews kind of have carved out group autonomy or sovereignty in the face of liberal assimilation or, fascist imperilment. And I just wanted to say that the book project itself seems almost like an expression of two Jewish academics doing just that. So in that sense, it was very interesting for me. My question was, Professor Stolzenberg, you posited the kind of libertarian toolkit which was used, and the kind of parallels with racial and socioeconomic segregation. I was wondering how aware or conscious the residents were of this, if at all. And I was also interested, the great parallel that sticks out to me seems to be with the Jewish Colonization Association, or with settlements in Israel, Mandatory Palestine, or even before then. And I was wondering how aware you two were, or the residents were, about parallels with other Jewish settlement projects.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll address the first question you take. So the answer to the question of how aware the Satmars were, I think there's really two levels of, first of all, just sort of the availability and the nature of this legal toolkit in the United States. And then the further question is, were they aware of the ways in which it was used to further or maintain racial and socioeconomic segregation? That's a sort of separate question. In terms of the first, there's just a fascinating process of legal learning that goes on in the community. They arrive here, they don't know, but they quickly learn the rules of the American game. And of course, by they, I'm referring primarily to the leadership and their different levels of it. But some of that really percolates into popular consciousness. And initially, it's about learning the rules of the political game, sort of interest group politics that they learn and master very quickly. But because there are so many legal battles, first of which are forced on them by outsiders, right? Initially, they're adhering to this principle that internal disputes should not be brought to Gentile courts. And prior to the original Rebbe's death, there really isn't much in the way of internal dispute. But already, since they're being challenged or they're running into zoning conflicts, they hire lawyers, and the lawyers play a fascinating role in translating the Satmar's values as well as interests into the language of American law. And then there's kind of a feedback loop that it really kind of alters and changes. I would say you sort of see the emergence of an American legal consciousness, albeit fused with their own legal consciousness, which is fascinating. One of the most striking manifestations of that, and this is really what led to the creation of the public school district. I said before, there's a puzzle. Why would this community even want a public school, since kids are sent to religious school, boys to yeshivas? Special education. There's so first of all, by law, special education has to be publicly funded, and it's administered through local school districts for all children, whether they go to public school or not, which created a very vexatious and really kind of never completely resolved constitutional issue for the United States. That wasn't specific to the Satmars at all. But as just as an example, we see an awakening of you might call it a disability rights consciousness or even a disability rights movement inside the Satmar community. Women at the helm, another interesting example of female leadership, notwithstanding their adherence to very traditional code of gender roles. And it's happening at the exact same time that the disability rights movement in the United States is taking off. There really isn't any lag time, contrary to a lot of perceptions to the contrary. And when I interviewed the woman who was really at the helm of that, and they're doing things that are just absolutely mirroring the logic of the American disability rights movement. It's happening at the same time. I said, were you aware of it? And she said no. So, I think there's a kind of cultural osmosis. Maybe at the beginning it's not conscious, but it comes to fuller consciousness. It's a really fascinating process.
The question was, is there awareness of other colonization efforts? Is that right?
Yeah.
Or were we aware of the parallel? We thought a lot about the parallels, the mini Zion.
So what I would say is this. This experiment belongs to a longer history of Jewish territorialist projects, of which we might enumerate the creation of a Jewish autonomous region in the Soviet Union, known as Azerbaijan, the kinds of neo-territorialist efforts that were made in places like Suriname that Laura Almagor has studied in her recent book, and of course Palestine. But as we suggested, there was no Palestine office of the Zionist organization. There was no Artur Lupin. There was no Jewish National Fund. There was no Jewish Colonization Association. This was not sort of about the mobilization of resources by quasi-state actors. This is about sort of the bottom-up pursuit of private property that almost immediately was transformed into a Hasidic public square. So there are many differences that we can point to, but Joel Teitelbaum was born in the great age of Jewish nationalism, and sort of sharpened his ideological vision at the crucible of Jewish nationalism, and particularly Zionism. I think there's little doubt in my mind that he imagined the Shtetl that he created as a kind of counter-Zion, as an alternative to a strong form of religious autonomy. In this case, it assumed the actual garb of local sovereignty that was an alternative to what he saw unfolding in Palestine and later the State of Israel. I should just say that he regarded Zionism, as he declared in his most important treatise on Zionism by El Moshe, as the greatest form of spiritual pollution the world has seen. His opposition to Zionism stemmed from the fact that Zionists, as he understood it, were attempting to arrogate to themselves the right to commence the Messianic process, a process that was exclusively a matter of divine discretion. And thus he had this very intense distaste for Zionism, but at the same time, in kind of the fascinating ways of Hasidic assimilation, absorbed some of the organizational strategies and even territorial ambitions of Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of replication. And to go to David's point about the Jewish National Fund, it conceives of itself as quasi-state, but quasi. So it's actually private. It's a private land purchasing agency. And so too, Kiryas Joel, on a much smaller scale, only 1 mile, it was created by a land purchasing agency, a real estate company that then becomes what's called the Vad HaKirya, quasi-private, but kind of sort of quasi-public, which has an ongoing role to this day in being the land purchasing agency. So I actually think there is a lot of unwitting replication of Zionist strategies, but it also shows that even for statist projects, the private pathway, the pathway to political sovereignty via the acquisition of land, of property through market transactions, that's actually something that maybe all, look at the history of land, how did the British and French settlers acquire land here? Less through conquest than through purchase. So.
We have time for a couple more questions.
So it occurs to me that what's really interesting here in terms of the history of Hasidism is these communities like New Square and Kiryas Joel represent a third wave. That is, Hasidism is a movement of the Shtetl, right? It takes place in these small market towns starting in the 18th century, throughout the 19th century. And then with World War I, it becomes an urban phenomenon. Vienna, Warsaw, Lemberg, and then of course later New York, Jerusalem, Bnei Brak. And this movement back to I would put actually quotation marks around the word Shtetl, which you made very clear in your presentation. This is not the historic Shtetl. This is a new phenomenon, although it has a bit of that nostalgic air to it. So it'll be very interesting to see to what degree going forward the movement, the Hasidic communities more and more gravitate towards these autonomous communities.
Right. So I would just say that I think what you've just charted is foremost attestation to the modernity of the phenomenon of Hasidism, because you're talking about rural settlement, urbanization, and then suburbanization for all intents and purposes, right? Mm-hmm. Modern American, it reveals for us what we call unwitting assimilation within the community, insofar as this is not a group of people who are able to resist the forces of the surrounding culture, and create a kind of hermetic bubble. They're constantly absorbing political, social, and cultural trends, including the aspiration to live a nice suburban existence. So I think that what you've described, David, really attests to that. Where is it going? Well, I think we have a good sense where it's going. There are going to be many more such communities that Hasidic groups are going to try to create, and there are going to be many more efforts to constrain them. So, for example, the New York state law that allows for the creation of a village has been changed in the last 4 months by a persistent foe and critic of Kiryas Joel and its seemingly bottomless appetite for land and water. State Senator James Skoufis, who succeeded in lifting the minimum number of residents required to support the effort to create a village from 500 to 1,500. So this battle is going to take place, and I have to say many residents of Orange County who are not Hasidic believe that they're going to lose because
population growth.
Population growth, although the community is by many measures extremely poor. In 2010, it was branded by the New York Times as the poorest community in America. There are ample resources to allow for the purchase of both land and housing stock. So they're going to be able to buy houses in the surrounding neighborhoods when Kiryas Joel sort of just explodes from density. And they're doing it. And residents of Orange County are aware of it and talk about sort of Orange County going completely Hasidic at some point. That's, I think, where we're headed. But there'll be many clashes and tensions and fights along the way.
That's a perfect segue to one of my two questions. I'll ask them both, but you don't have to answer both of them. So the first one is, in the battles with the non-Jewish population of Monroe, Was there an emergence of an anti-Semitic trope that the Jews are destroying our community, maybe even poisoning our wells? Within the Satmar community, in the larger Jewish community surrounding the Haredi and Orthodox world, and in Jewish and general media. The second question, completely unrelated, is about the role of women. So once they have a public school, presumably there are boys' schools and girls' schools, and I'm assuming the girls' schools are run primarily by women, certainly the school board and the women as the PTA. And have there been tension between the boys' schools, presumably run by men, the girls' schools run by women in terms of access to resources, agendas, etc.?
So I'll address the second question. So the public school that was established once the law was passed allowing the village to have its own public school district only serves children with special needs. All the other children go to the very robust network of private religious schools. So the public school, furthermore, it's only children with profound special needs who attend it. It is coeducational. It is not a religious school. They are very up to date on sort of the cutting edge of special education. So the involvement of parents is very interesting, and PTAs and all of that. But it's really, it's not a situation in which the creation of a public school district has enabled the community to essentially run its private religious schools as public schools with public funding. That's not what's going on yet. I will just say footnote, it's not the Hasidic agenda to do this, but it is a very strong agenda of, I think, not a fringe of the conservative legal movement to get the Supreme Court to overturn interpretations of the Constitution that would prevent the state from directly funding religious schools. I will not be surprised if the day of direct state funding of parochial schools comes and comes soon. And if and when that happens, then the scenario that you're describing might very well take place, not because of the Satmars, but because of other elements in American society.
And just a word about the school. The overarching administrator of the main girls' school system is a man, though the operational administrator is a woman. So sort of the principal answers to the head of school, who is a man. There were ample anti-Semitic tropes that were expressed very often in letters to the editor of the local newspaper, along the lines of Jews are parasites. Satmar Hasidim are parasites, are unkempt, are acquisitive, are self-interested, are disloyal. All of these tropes were sounded, not infrequently. The chief opposition to the ongoing growth of Kiryas Joel, a group called United Monroe, really tried to avoid any lapsing into such stereotypes or language, largely successfully, though not successfully enough for the mainstream faction in Kiryas Joel, which very often accused them of being anti-Semitic. Curiously, in sort of the cosmic choreography of this world, one of the chief dissident groups within Kiryas Joel aligned itself with United Monroe and disputed the characterization of its opposition as anti-Semitic. I would say, on my read, most of the people of United Monroe were not anti-Semitic in their motivation. In an earlier period in time when it might have been somewhat more legitimate to give expression to overtly anti-Semitic themes, they were heard, as I said, often in public meetings or even in the newspaper. But this has been a battle that has been ongoing. The allegation that anti-Semitism exists and is a chief deterrent to the ongoing growth of the community, and on the other hand, plus ça change, we hear it today, the weaponization of the claim of anti-Semitism by the establishment in Kiryas Joel in order to achieve its ends. So it really resonates with larger American culture in ways that affirms how American the phenomenon is.
Let's take two more questions together, and then you guys can respond to whatever you want in those, because I know we're really at the end of time. My friend Revolution.
Hi. This is a question specifically for you, David. You said that there was growth in the midst of the conflict. I'm wondering, is that beyond the birth rate? Because I don't recall I don't recall drawing new members in, but you said that the conflict within the Samer community created growth. Right? So if I misunderstood, but that was my question. Was it birth rate, or was they actually drew new people in?
That's right. So
sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And anybody else? Okay.
Hi, I was wondering if you'd be able to elaborate on sort of the nature of the poverty within the community. You mentioned a few minutes ago that there is, say, poverty within the community, but there is still sufficient wealth sort of across the community to continue purchasing land in the outlying areas of Kiryas Joel. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask one last question.
Yeah, sure.
Which is, the book's been out now, I guess, for a year and a half to 2 years. David, you told us early on about the community's willingness and even eagerness to hold a mirror up to itself. Now your mirror exists, and I was just wondering if you could say a word about how the book has been received in Kiryas Joel.
Okay, I want to clarify. Combat is kind of constitutive feature of the Teitelbaum way. At a minimum, the Satmar Hasidic community and Kiryas Joel have grown in the presence of strife. And it may well be, I surmise, this is not empirically verifiable, that strife and tension help to sharpen a sense of mission that sort of allow for the fulfillment of what has been called the imperial vision of Satmar. What is curious is that when that combative spirit turned in on the community in the form of the dissident factions, it did not deter the ongoing growth of the community, which occurred, now to get to the heart of your question, exclusively as a result of natural growth from within. This is a community that does not favor the Chabad practice of kiruv, of outreach to bring people into the community. It is the case that there are people who are drawn to this lifestyle. Very small numbers, people join the community. The growth is almost entirely the result of the highest birth rate in the state of New York. Poverty. So in 2010, 60% of Kiryas Joel lived below the poverty line. And I think in the latest census it was about 43%, which is quite high. But it's important to note what poverty means is that if you are the chief breadwinner and have 12 children and earn $70,000, you will be categorized according to the federal regulations, federal standards, as below the poverty line. So it has a lot to do with family size and income and how the government calculates what poverty looks like. Which is to say, if you go to Kiryas Joel, there's no discernible trace of poverty on the streets that one might see in other communities in the United States. And that is because there's a tremendous spirit of self-help within the community. I should say there's also very considerable support from the state, both the state and federal government, one of the chief sources of income in the community, along with self-employment and an extensive charitable network, which is really propelled forward by a number of exceptionally wealthy Satmar Hasidic benefactors. So you have state support, you have sort of regular employment within the community, and you have this quite remarkable charitable network whereby it doesn't depend exclusively on the billionaires within the community. If you have more resources than your neighbor, whom you may not know that well, and the neighbor's having trouble paying for a wedding in Kiryas Joel, you will unquestionably give that person money to help marry off their child. Finally, how was it received? I can't say that a substantial number of copies of this book was sold in the community. I mean, that would be. However, we were in touch with dozens of people, and I think maybe half of those dozens read the book or read parts of it, and maybe Nomi will share the account of one of the closest readers.
I gladly. I do just want to add a couple of points about poverty. Besides the fact that there's change over time and there's been a process of rising standards of living and also rising levels of participation of women in the workforce and sort of a process of embourgeoisement, two things. One is even in the period of time when the community was at its least wealthy in the aggregate, it functions as an aggregate. So in the same way as even when it was quite small, it could magnify its political clout, its electoral clout, by virtue of the block vote, by virtue of how cohesive it was. Similarly, at a time when really most of the people were not people of considerable means, the private pathway to political empowerment depends on access to capital. How does such a poor community have access to capital? I mean, part of it is that there are some now billionaires, then maybe millionaires, but it's the cohesion that was able to magnify the economic clout just as the block vote served to magnify the political clout. Second point about poverty.
About the block vote. We could go on for another hour about that.
One of the things that I just found just such a delectable detail, even as there really has been this process of embourgeoisement, materialism remains, this was, by definition, an anti-materialist community. That's one of the core values. We are eschewing the pursuit of material success, that we don't go to higher education. We eschew that in favor of spiritual welfare. And so there's sort of a competition between Williamsburg and Kiryas Joel, and each community disparages the other community for being materialist, right? So in Satmar, in Kiryas Joel, they'll say, well, in Williamsburg, in the city, they're so much more materialist. And then in Williamsburg, they'll say, in the suburbs.
Shtetl.
I'll end with this story. So we did many book talks. The vast majority of them were on Zoom. The book came out in the days of confinement. One of the relatively few other, it's such a pleasure to be with all of you in real life, and one of the first, I think, was at Rutgers. And it was a big room with a big crowd of people, a lot of people, and a lot of educators, right? New Jersey, New York, so a lot of people. I think a lot of retired educators who had very, very strong feelings and almost came to fisticuffs with one another. These were the secular Jews in the audience.
No, not exclusively.
Maybe not exclusively. So we were kind of mobbed at the end of this talk by all these people.
There was kind of a mob that took rise and it was almost
it was a little crazy, yeah. But patiently waiting was a man who, when finally, the crowd thinned out, and he approached me, a man with pious, and he introduced himself, and he said, I'm from Kiryas Joel. He said, what did he say? Something like, I've been reading your work since, way before the book came out. He's been reading my work. I've been following your work. And then he says, he was the loveliest person, obviously just highly intelligent, thoughtful, reflective man. And he said, yes, I have a sort of reading group, and I won a bet with my friend in the reading group. I said to him, you was married. And he didn't believe me, but if we didn't make it clear, we are married. He said, I won the bet. I can't wait to tell my friend. So there are some readers in the community, and everyone we've heard from has been positive.
Okay,
I'll just say one thing, except one person said, you missed, we talked about violence, and we described a scenario in which one guy punched another guy in the nose. I'm responsible for all of the factual errors in the book. We were wrong guy. We named the wrong guy. So yeah,
It wasn't Beryl.
it was it's similar names.
It was Beryl.
Confusing.
Okay, I'll just to wrap up. I'll just mention the response I received from one of my closest contacts in the community. Someone who's enormously helpful to me, as was his wife, who she belongs to an extraordinary trio of women, each of whom belongs to a leading family in one of the three competing factions in the community. And these three women are best friends. And this woman strains against the constraints while at the same time saying, Kiryas Joel, as Nomi said, is the most beautiful form of existence known to humanity. Her husband, successful businessman, had an electronics retail operation in New Jersey, and then opened up maybe even a wholesale outfit in South Carolina. And he was on the road, and he would communicate with me in the ways that Hasidic Jews communicate, via WhatsApp, audio messages. And he would say, David, I read the first 25 pages. Not bad.
Yeah, so far, pretty good.
David, I'm up to page
And my
78.
wife says,
I'm up to page 78. My wife says the book's very good. She's not wrong. And then at page 125, he said, I haven't found any mistakes. And that I found to be, the greatest affirmation of the book's worth that I can imagine.